have water.
Yes, okay. Great, good afternoon. Hello, and welcome to the National Constitution Center. I'm Lana Ulrich, in-house counsel for the center, and I want to thank you for coming out to today's program. I have a quick, important announcement. Dambisa Mayo, who's the author of Edge of Chaos, the book that was being featured today, unfortunately had a last-minute family emergency, and so cannot make it. So our thoughts and our prayers are with her family. However, the show must go on, and we are fortunate that Professor Michael Greve was still able to make it here for our program, and we still hope to have a thoughtful and engaging conversation about the state of democracy today, picking up on a lot of the themes of Dambisa's book. Before I introduce our panelists and we get to the program, I just have one quick announcement. May is Members Month here at the NCC. Tomorrow is our Members Open House. NCC members and their family and friends are invited to tomorrow's open house from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. The open house will have featured guided tours of our new Hamilton exhibit, including a behind-the-scenes artifact discussion and a performance of Living News, which is our live theater program. You can enjoy additional savings at Delegates Cafe and our museum store, and you save 20% when you become a new member. So if you're interested, please see Rebecca in the back or stop by our membership table after the program. Okay, so now for our discussion. I'm here today talking with Professor Michael Greve. He is a professor of law at George Mason University's Antonin Scalia School of Law. He previously served as John G. Searle Scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and served as chairman of the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Prior to joining AEI, he was founder and co-director of the Center for Individual Rights, which is a public interest law firm that specializes in constitutional litigation. He is also the author of numerous books, including The Upside Down Constitution. Please join me in welcoming Professor Michael Greve. Okay, so Mike, let's just start off with the topic of Dambisa's book. And we were talking about how there's a lot being written today about the state of democracy and threats to it. And Dambisa's book argues that liberal democracy is now being threatened by economic forces. And so do you agree, first of all, that liberal democracy is under threat today, facing a crisis? And if so, are there economic challenges to it, or is there other factors?
Yeah. First, let me say thank you for the invitation. It's terrific to be here. It's one of my favorite places and one of my favorite cities. Let me join you in sort of sending best wishes to Dambisa and her family. Hope everyone is well. This is sort of my favorite event now. I get to talk about somebody else's book and she can't fight back. And so, and it would have been fun, and it is fun because there's sort of a third of a book that I agree with, and then there's a third that I'm not quite sure about, and a third maybe that I disagree with. That's a sort of kind of productive exchange you hope for. What I think is very important about the book is one of the things that sort of unites a lot of countries around the world now, which is collapsing or at least receding economic growth rates. And this is true of Europe, it's true of the United States, it's a very long-term trend. It's true of many developing countries, true of China, and so forth. And that has, she argues, a lot of consequences around the globe. I agree with that. Among other things, it's much, much harder to make democracies, liberal democracies, work very well if you don't have economic growth, right? I mean, the formula that we always had in Germany, which is where I was born and raised, was you can redistribute economic growth and you cannot redistribute what people already have, because that is a zero-sum fight. And the people from whom you take it away react very badly if you do it, right? But with economic growth, you can sort of distribute the surplus and create a more sort of reasonably just society. So growth, and by the same token, a lack of growth also puts enormous strains on authoritarian governments, albeit in somewhat different ways. So that is a big thing, and then there's a large part of the book where Dambisa outlines why any effort to recreate or re-accelerate growth faces severe headwinds, as she calls it, that has demographic reasons. If there's a huge debt overhang, those and other factors, make you a little nervous about all of that. The part that the two questions that may be worth sort of pursuing a little. I think the relation between sort of growth and liberal democracy goes both ways. So on the one hand, economic growth makes it easier to run liberal democracies, keep people happy. That's one of the expectations we have of democratic governments, that they're supposed to improve people's lives, or rather create a stable political environment where people can go about their business and make the most of their own God-given talents. But the reverse is also true, that when the institutions go bad for reasons having to do with a lack of growth or other reasons, governments can do an awful lot to screw up the economy and to put impediments in the way of economic progress. So it's, joint causation. It runs both ways to my mind. And then the final thing I'll say by way of sort of introduction, and please let's pursue any of these directions that you would like, is that there is, of course, a great deal of concern about the state of democracy, of liberal democracy around the world. And that reaches from the Trump phenomenon in the United States to the rise of populism both on the left and on the right in Europe, to Chinese and Russian attempts to subvert democracies around the world, to the rise of sort of big authoritarian governments in China, Russia, Iran, Turkey, Venezuela, and so forth. I'm not at all sure that all of those things, at one level, at a very high level of abstraction, they may all be related. But I think there are a lot of things going on in different parts of the world, and my intuition, so having been trained as a political scientist before I became a boring law prof, is to sort of disaggregate these things a little.
Yeah, I think that's great, and I think we should pursue that, trying to disaggregate the question a little bit more. And so we could focus maybe on the United States and Europe, and a lot of the commentary tends to lump, as you mentioned, the Donald Trump phenomenon with, say, the Brexit referendum in the same kind of sentence. And are there different forces at work in the UK versus in the United States in terms of what might have led to a referendum like Brexit?
Yeah, there are a number of connecting factors that people have remarked upon, and I think rightly. One is the immigration question, which loomed large in the United States election as well as in Great Britain. Another connecting factor is sort of the revolt against the elites. The sense that you've walked us into this mess, enough is enough, we're now going to pull the trigger. And if you ask us, we're not quite sure what happens afterwards. Nobody had really planned through what would happen if Britain actually exited and what are the consequences. It was just people lashed out in a way that's probably also right of the American election. That said, there are obvious differences. Brexit is, it's about Europe, the European Union. And we don't have that question hanging over us in quite the same way, obviously. And that makes a lot of institutional differences, I think. Mm-hmm. And the final thing I'll say is that if you look at the I'm not an expert on elections at all, but it is striking that, the areas in England that voted for Remain, or London and the big centers, right? So it's an urban-rural divide, which we also have in the United States, which played out very, very prominently in 2016.
Right, and I think Dambisa notes that in her book as well, that on the coast, California and New York tend to be, if you look at the popular vote in favor of Hillary Clinton, if you remove those two areas, in fact, Donald Trump would have won the popular vote, taking those places aside. Yeah, we talked about this backlash against the elites, and that's something that Dambisa and others have written about, this idea of the failure of either the incumbent politicians or this idea of political myopia that politicians today, and perhaps even voters, are a little short-sighted. And some of her reforms that she suggests are electoral, like reforming the frequency of elections, let's say, in the United States, or even instituting minimum requirements of voters. And I thought those were very interesting and perhaps controversial reforms. And so I was just hoping to get your thoughts on those ideas, and whether or not you thought that such a reform would even be constitutional in the United States, or might even require a constitutional amendment.
So Dambisa, to sort of add a little to this, has two sets of proposals. One is to introduce political reforms that make politicians a little more far-sighted rather than short-term oriented, such as longer terms in office, term limits, those kinds of things. And then there's a separate set of proposals which basically say, we should elect ourselves another American people. Tiered voting rights for people who pass, high levels of civics tests, fewer votes for those who don't, that kind of thing. As she says, that would obviously require a constitutional amendment, and she realizes that this is bound to be quite controversial for all sorts of reasons. I'll say two things about it, and again, I don't mean to be unfair, and it's somewhat awkward for all the joking about beating up on somebody who's not here. It's somewhat awkward to do it. But I'll say two things. One is there's an aspect of political myopia and short-term orientation that she doesn't discuss, but which I think is very, very important and very alarming. And that is that we used to have an awful lot of unwritten constitutional norms, right? Constitutional conventions, you can call them. They're not written in the Constitution, and there are no statutes that say you have to do X, Y, or Z. But you observe norms of good behavior because you ask yourself, what if the other guys or gals win and they did that to us and we wouldn't like that, and so we're not going to do that to them in the first place, right? And rapidly over the past 20 years or so, those norms have broken down, starting by my lights of sometime in the 1990s, and progressively so over time. And some of that is a result of sort of institutional competition between the president on the one hand and Congress on the other, right? So you have consecutive presidents now who say, we can't wait, and therefore we'll do without Congress, what is basically Congress's job to do. And then you have somebody else who says, I alone can fix it, and I don't care about the Congress either. And a lot of pottery got broken in that particular sort of institutional combat between the branches. Other conventions are sort of purely in Congress. Those have broken down. Sort of the way we talk, right, about each other and with each other, that has gotten worse. And that is really a form of short-term thinking that I think is very dangerous to democratic government. Dambisa doesn't talk about it, but I think it fits into the same category and is worth thinking about. The other thing that I'll say is that we have institutions that are built to be a little more long-term oriented, which we call administrative agencies, right? The entire point of having administrative agencies that aren't in the Constitution, that aren't executive really, because they're independent often, that aren't legislative, they're not courts either, but they do all of those things. The reason for creating those institutions was precisely to say, let's insulate them and their thinking and their expertise from politicians who always look at what do my voters want this minute or the next minute. My own sense is that people's confidence in those kinds of institutions has rapidly declined over the years. And I mean, maybe it's like, it may be a professional hazard. If I had to write a book about that topic, it's, you know, I'd say a little bit more about administration and bureaucratic agencies and why their performance has been so unsatisfying over the past decades and caused a lot of discontent, I think.
Yeah, you've written a lot about the administrative state, and some of the criticism is not...
See, I just try to drag you on my turf, so now...
Well, it's certainly relevant, and some of the criticism is not always directly aimed at the agencies themselves, but at Congress, who often legislates very broadly and leaves things open-ended for the agencies to interpret. Some might say to avoid having to, you know, feel the political effects of any negative decision. To what extent is Congress responsible for that? So that is a very large theme. And by the way, this is one theme that, again, connects, I think, Europe to the United States, the decline of legislative institutions. So the decline of Congress, and I'll say a little more in a moment, and the rise of executive government. That's also true of most European countries. It's true of France. President Macron is the arrival of presidential government, full-scale presidential government in France. A lot of them think, I mean, a lot of French citizens think, "Ooh, that looks a little too presidential and dictatorial to us," but for now he has a lot of support. It's true of the European Union at large, which has for, you know, the time of its duration been a project of executives with a very, very weak European Parliament that isn't really a full-scale parliament in our sense at all. So that goes on in Europe, and there's a lot of discontent with that form of government there, and it's gone on in the United States, the sort of rise of presidential government. And this is something that lots of people have written about, both in the law reviews and political scientists and so forth. Most of them date this to the 1980s, and it's become progressively more acute. And over time, Congress's legislative capacity has dramatically declined. I mean, you know, what you get out of Congress is either no legislation at all, even when you can tell there is a broad consensus if these people could get together and behave like legislators, right? I mean, immigration is, I think, one example where they came close several times and still it fell apart. So either they don't legislate at all, or they have these 1,100 masterpieces that are basically kludges, and then everybody has to sort of try to figure out how do we deal with the Dodd-Frank Act or the Affordable Care Act. Whether you're for it or against it at the end doesn't even matter. What matters is it's 1,100 pages of waiver provisions, and it's not a law, it's what the executive makes of it at the end of the day. And in recent years, the Congress has even sort of effectively surrendered other legislative powers that it has, the power of the purse,
right? So much of the budget is already spent by the time Congress meets that it doesn't matter anymore. It's either entitlements or debt payments, or it's defense, and it's either executive discretion or automatic spending. What does Congress have to do with it? It doesn't control very much of it. If you talk to congressional staffers these days and say, why don't you guys have some hearings? And I don't mean, the hearings about some scandal or whatever, but just oversight hearings over, I don't know, the Food and Drug Administration or the Commerce Department or something like that. They don't do that anymore because they say, look, the executive officials come here and they blow smoke or lie to us, and then they go home, and we have no way of disciplining them one way or the other. So why should we hold a hearing? And that is kind of a depressing state of affairs. There are lots of theories where this comes from. My own view is that it has a great deal to do, the sort of rise of executive power and the decline of Congress, that has a lot to do with our expectations of government. So Congress is pretty good, or used to be pretty good, at deciding who gets what, right? So it writes programs about, I don't know, food stamps or something like that, or trade assistance. That it can, or a highway bill, or agriculture supports. That it can do. Congress isn't really good if it comes to expectations that are harbored by narrower and narrower constituencies, it isn't very good at negotiating sort of abstract values that people have. So everybody expects that Congress do something about student dating behavior on campuses, because that's sexual harassment, or might be. Can Congress seriously do that? No, it can't, right? Everybody expects Congress to do something about global warming or about biodiversity, in the sense of the last toad that is endangered still has to be protected. Can Congress do that? No, it just doesn't have the capacity. And so all it can really do is to set up these little special purpose governments that are sort of called administrative agencies, and frequently they're state or local based, sometimes they're federal, where people who are concerned about that particular aspect of public life can go and haggle things out. And in lots of ways, those institutions in Washington are a lot more, quote unquote, democratic and accessible and open and reasonable than the legislature itself. But they are executive agencies. And so this isn't, the rise of executive government, for the most part, isn't a result of autocrats strolling in and grabbing power from Congress, right? It's a process of abdication by Congress itself.
It's interesting, because typically the conservative critique of the administrative agencies is, as you said, this sort of power grab, and also congressional abdication and this technocratic rule by experts. But it sounds like there is true value in having that. In some cases,
there may be, right? My view of it is that a lot depends. There are some issues that are really very involved and complicated, and it's best to have people involved in that who really know what they're doing. However, there is a real cost to democracy under those kinds of circumstances, and there are compensating risks on the other side of running the show that way, right? So one of them is tunnel vision. If you really care about endangered species and that's all you do 24/7, right? It would be good to sort of have somebody else take a look at that and say, wait a minute, how does that, it's important, I get it, but how does that fit into our broader sort of set of priorities, and there's a difference between taking that seriously and getting obsessed over it, and that goes for everything. I'm not dumping on endangered species in particular. It was just the first example that came to my mind. And then there's a real risk of sort of what some political scientists call cultural capture. So if you spend time in and around financial agencies, the Treasury Department or the FDIC or the Securities Exchange Commission, all right? All those people who are in that culture, I mean, they may be Democrats or they may be Republicans, or they may work for a trade union or labor union, or they may work for big business, but they all speak the same language. They're all trained in the same things. And so they miss stuff that could be really important. And by some lights, that kind of specialization, had a lot to do with the financial crisis. There was a bunch of people who talk the same, look at the same data, have the same professional background and the same kind of myopia. That's a different kind of myopia than Dambisa talks about. But I think it's proven quite consequential. And this is a big problem.
Yeah. To what extent is the lack of oversight the fault of the courts, for instance, with Chevron deference and doctrines like that kind of just defer to agency rulemaking or agency interpretation of statutes?
Yeah, I mean, this is another sort of nostrum. People's sentiments about this, mind you, have changed. So the basic rule in administrative law, which is what I teach, or part of or one of the courses that I teach, is that courts are supposed to be deferential to agencies. That is, until or unless the agency really made an obvious big mistake, courts are supposed to say the language is ambiguous in the statute, we don't know any better than the agency what it means, and so therefore let them have their way. For the duration of the Obama administration, that was a principal target of all the conservatives, that doctrine, and if only we could get rid of it and have the courts run herd on federal agencies. And now it's flipped, right? Now a lot of people on the liberal side want courts to take a very, very close look at what the INS or whoever it is, or the Federal Communications Commission is doing under the Trump administration. So to a large extent, that's a partisan thing. And people always want a lot of judicial review so long as it's exercised by their friends on the federal bench. And in that sense, they're consistent about it. I'll say this much about it. There are 1,000 federal judges in the country, all told. HHS alone has 220,000 employees, a budget of something like $1.3 trillion. If you really wanted to rely on judges to hold the executive branch within bounds, you'd need a whole lot more of them, right? It's just too big, right? And there are any number of things that any administrator learns the first day in office, how to evade judicial review. So, I mean, that's what you do for a living. So I wouldn't, I wouldn't get my hopes up on that score. But you're right. I mean, when it comes to sort of thinking about the perils that arise to liberal government from unconstrained, unchecked executive power, there are really only two places where you can look. One is the Congress and the other one is the courts. And people are ambivalent about how these things sort of fit together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in addition to the checks among the federal branches of government, we also have a federalism system in the United States. And to what extent is federalism currently working to help either improve or maintain liberal democracy in the United States? I know there was a lot of talk, obviously after President Trump was elected and Republicans took over the Congress and the Supreme Court that now in the states, progressives have kind of revived federalism and are passing statewide referenda and things like that. Is that good for our constitutional democracy, and what are the effects of that?
I am actually, let's put it this way, mildly optimistic on that score. I'm nervous about any kind of power that is the only game in town, right? And that's my nervousness about executive power. I mean, who knows whether at the end of the day Congress would actually do a better job of this stuff or not. I don't know. I just don't want any one branch or institution to have so much unchecked and uncheckable power. And it's been true under both the Obama administration and the Trump administration that states have sort of reemerged as rival power centers. The caveat is this. We tend to think, and this is how federalism is taught in grade school and high school and college, and unfortunately also in law school. We think of this as the states as against the federal government, and then the states, all 50 of them, will manfully resist the impositions of the federal government, and then that's federalism. That's not how it's worked for most of our history. That's not how it's working now. There are blocks of states. Right? There are red state blocks, and then there's a blue state block, and everybody in the audience knows who I'm talking about. Right? And they both have anchor states. So the red state block anchor is Texas, and then on the other side it's California, and New York, and Illinois, and Connecticut. And the divide doesn't really run between the states and Washington, D.C. It runs among and between blocks of states, one of them aligned with the powers that be in Washington, and the other ones against it. And so, under the Obama administration, there was a block, relatively cohesive block, 16 plus states that sort of resolutely opposed anything the Obama administration was trying to do, from the Affordable Care Act to particularly energy and environmental policy, because if you look at those states, Texas, Oklahoma, North Dakota, they're all energy producing states, and they viewed the Obama administration's initiatives on climate change and the rest as a menace to their business model. Right? And so now it's blue states, so New York and California and Illinois, that view the Trump agenda with a certain amount of justification as a threat to their business model, and so now they are fighting back over things where you think, obviously over things where their livelihood is at stake. So federal transfer payments to the states, right there you can see why that is of essential concern to them. But I saw a story today. There's a complaint by 20 states about net neutrality. I have yet to figure out what's that got to do with state government. But what it does show is that state governments, when all is said and done, are pretty good places to organize political resistance against sort of an overbearing federal government. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's issues of federalism involved in this Wayfair case now that the Supreme Court's hearing, and it implicates this dormant commerce clause doctrine, which is something I vaguely remember from law school. But I was listening to a podcast where you mentioned that this was one of the central doctrines that led to the United States becoming a powerhouse in the modern century. And is there some kind of relationship there that we should be looking at this kind of doctrine, or what are the effects of maybe decision on Wayfair, either on federalism doctrine or maybe the future of the economy?
Yeah, so the Wayfair case, Lana mentioned, this has to do with internet taxes, right? Taxes on stuff that you order over the internet. And then the question is, can states make sellers that have no connection to your state, to the purchaser's state, collect and remit the taxes and subject them to auditing requirements. That doesn't quite break down between red and blue at all. It breaks down between no sales tax states, right, and states with a big sales tax. So I remember I testified in the Senate on this. So my biggest fan was, Max Baucus, Senator Baucus. He's from Montana, and if you tell him there will be no tax collection obligations on this stuff, great Greve, go. So that breaks down a little differently. I think where that particular doctrine or these relations between states will play a big role, have already and will in the future, has to do with production and in particular energy production, right? So the blue states have their business model, which reflects sort of very high domestic demand for environmental amenities and so forth, very high energy costs, very high transfer payments, relative, that is, to red states. And what red states want to do is produce a lot of cheap energy and, make a go of it and be sort of production-oriented states. And those state blocks are in competition with one another. And that competition plays out in a lot of venues. So, for example, the tax reform, as many of you will know, reformed the deductibility of state and local income taxes. That had huge implications with respect to blue versus red states. And the other part of it is if you're a blue state and your producers suffer from or have to put up with high energy costs, you have to find a way to raise energy costs in red states as well. And the question is whether the Constitution allows that or not. And that has surfaced in any number of lawsuits. The Supreme Court hasn't heard any of them, but one of these days it will have to.
Mm-hmm. Great. So we have a number of great audience questions. We'll try to get through as many as we can. This kind of jumps
I'll
off.
talk faster.
This jumps off the red state, blue state question. It's fairly broad, so feel free to answer as you like. But the question is, what is the effect on democratic principles from 1, gerrymandering, 2, population shifts from blue to red states, and 3, lack of economic equality?
Yeah. So, how much time do I have? I think the consensus among the broad consensus among political scientists and people who study elections think that gerrymandering at the end of the day doesn't make all that much of a difference with respect to outcomes. I do think it has a certain, can I prove this now? No. But I think it has a certain demoralizing effect on people, right? It's not good to be told that, hey, your politicians just you, and you in my district and everybody else. That is, it looks corrupt. But in terms of overall outcomes, there wouldn't be that much of a difference, is at least how I understand the most of the studies. And mind you, there's polarization also at the state levels, and states aren't gerrymandered, right? They are just what they are. There was one other question, one more thing?
Yes, it was the movement from population shifts from the blue to the red states, and then the question of economic equality.
Yes. That has a number of consequences. First of all, the loss of electoral votes, right? California has moved sideways. New York has lost a lot of votes. Texas Florida, those states. So it shifts the power relations in that way. The long-term question, and mind you, I mean, it has big economic consequences as well. The long-term question that's really interesting is, what if Texas were to turn blue? Right? That would change an awful lot in American politics and would sort of change the dynamics of American politics in very, very fundamental ways. And my sense of it is that when people move from New York to, I don't know, Tennessee, North Carolina, Texas, they don't all of a sudden change their political stripes. So it may have some effect there. I'm sure people have studied this. I just haven't. But that's sort of an interesting question that looms in my mind. And the inequality thing, the inequality question, that I think is quite pressing in some ways. But at the risk of sounding evasive, my sense of it is that it goes back to Dambisa's point, which is growth. Mm-hmm. So if you had an economy where, wages rise pretty well and substantially as opposed to moving sideways, there wouldn't be the same attention to inequality, right? And I mean, look, you could improve equality in the United States by the Gini coefficient by which they measure it, but just rounding up the 100 richest people in the country and confiscating their entire wealth and be done with it. There would be much less measured inequality. The question is, do we think anybody would be better off? Right? I think it's the stagnation of incomes and impediments to social mobility that account for a lot of the discontent, and inequality, measured inequality, is just a convenient way of sort of focusing that particular debate.
So there's one question that's kind of the flip side of that, which is, do declining growth rates often lead to fascism?
Well, we're not there yet.
Or anywhere in the world.
The word has come up, right? Mm-hmm. Madeleine Albright has written a book about that. I don't think there's any direct connection. One of the things, this may seem far-fetched, but during the 19th century, the American economy, and in fact most economies in the world, were boom and bust, right? There were constant panics, which we now call a depression. The way the depression got its name, the 1930s depression, was the politicians said to themselves, oh man, if we call it a panic, everybody will panic. That's bad. So let's just call it a depression. It had a somewhat more cheerful ring to it. Right? And we created we created all sorts of institutions to smooth out business cycles and to create more economic stability, or so at least it was hoped. That's what the Federal Reserve was supposed to do, and what a lot of social programs were supposed to do. We just have much less tolerance than people used to have for boom and bust cycles. And the reality was that the busts in those days, they did have political repercussions, and people responded to them, and you had violent strikes and all the rest of it. But it didn't destabilize American liberal democracy in any fundamental way. So in that sense, I don't think there is sort of a direct connect between flagging growth rates and impending fascism. But right, countries are stable for one reason or more or less stable for one reason or another. So I'd be, there are obvious examples where that scenario did play out. There are lots of cases where it didn't.
Yeah.
So.
There's a couple questions that talk a little bit more about the electorate and an informed electorate. This question asks, many scholars seem to agree that democracies need an informed electorate to both thrive and survive, yet people in the United States seem to favor ideology over facts. How do we get back to a better informed public, to fact-based policy making, and will democracy disintegrate if we don't? And I guess, do you agree with the premise as well?
I want to be a little careful. At some level, right, democracy sort of, or democratic, liberal democracy, let's call it that way, right, it requires a certain kind of citizen. I think that's right. And a certain level of education, and I don't mean education in the sense of do you have an MA, I mean education in sort of a sense of general awareness of things around you and a certain kind of level-headedness about the world. I am not sure at all that political engagement, even voting, is part of that. Because I think, especially if politics occupies a big piece of our lives, right? It doesn't matter so much if you're in the Old West and you don't even know where the national government, what it even does, right? But by now, most of our lives depend in one way or another on the operation of government, no matter how independent we think we are, right? Behind me stands the full faith and credit of the Commonwealth of Virginia. So right? So in a lot of ways, we depend on that, especially when that is true. There's a big premium on very highly educated people engaging in politics. They're just better able to do that. They are better able to reap rewards that people who don't possess those kinds of skills aren't able to exercise. So, right, and so in that sense, it's best to have some sort of barriers to political access, maybe a little less political engagement and more preoccupation with people's private affairs would be better for the functioning of democracy.
Mm-hmm. It's more of a...
Because, it's easy to say more political participation by engaged citizens. That would make things better, and I just don't think that's true because the political process is inherently biased towards those with access and money and high cognitive skills.
Mm-hmm. That's what the framers, I guess, almost had in mind. Even the Madisonian vision is this sense of kind of the elites in government, and we'd filter the people's will through representatives, right? Not just a direct democracy here, but a representative republic, to kind of slow things down, slow down.
Yeah, they were. In a lot of ways, they were very ambivalent about it, right? So, on the one hand, James Madison had this idea of filtration, right? So the idea was that we have to exclude the people of America in their collective capacity entirely from the operations of government. That is sort of democracy, and in that sense, democracy to them was a dirty word. And so what they hoped for was that representation, elections by large districts, would somehow dampen those passions and tend to select politicians who sort of preoccupy themselves with the great ideas of state, foreign affairs, war, commerce, that sort of thing, and who wouldn't try to micromanage people's lives. Right? 15 minutes into the first Congress, Madison discovered, oops, that was a mistake, and it never worked. But they also had the sense that, look, if you have a political system that's completely open to anyone who asks favors, that would be extremely bad, and it would reward the enterprising. And mind you, not the enterprising in the private sector, but the enterprising people in politics, and this would be a very bad idea. This comes up, I think it's Federalist 62, where Madison talks about a mutable government, and why a mutable government, that is a government that sort of jumps from one thing to the next and changes policy from one day to the next, would be really, really bad and demoralizing for the country, because it would just hand rewards to people who can follow the affairs of government day in, day out, who have lobbyists. I mean, you read that piece of Madison's, one of my favorite. Gee, that guy has watched way too much Fox News. I mean, it sounds really, really modern, and they knew what they were talking about. So what they tried to do was create a government that absolutely it had to be accountable to the people. We can't have a House of Lords in America, so in that sense it has to be democratic. But you have to create some agency slack between your elected representatives on the one hand and the electorate on the other. Because if you live in the system we live in now, which is, it's not even 24/7 news cycles anymore. It's tweet, 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 right? And they're followed 24/7, day in, day out. If you're a politician, how are you going to do a deal with somebody from the other party? It's out there in the open instantaneously, you can't do anything. So in that sense, the system is just too democratic, because there's just no agency slack for these people to sort of engage in the ordinary business of politics ever at all. And so it's all grandstanding, where 535 congressmen try to compete with Donald Trump, and good luck to them.
All right. This question asks about campaign finance, and asks you to discuss McCutcheon and the contributions of billionaires like Sheldon Adelson to Friends of Tax Relief, and how this may or may not affect democracy in America.
You could, in theory, imagine a system that's completely different, right? Public financing of elections and total prohibitions on campaign contributions. I don't know what effect that would have. I mean, other than billionaires could always give themselves money and self-finance their campaigns, and that's been a growing tendency. Color me a skeptic on campaign finance reform. I mean, we've messed around with it now for well over a century. I mean, when it all started, and increasingly since the 1970s, and all we've succeeded in doing is make the money travel longer ways and make it more complicated in a lot of ways. To no beneficial effect that I could see. If I had my druthers, what I really think would help is to rethink the campaign finance laws in a way that would strengthen parties. And I mean the party apparatus, right? Because one of the things that parties do is organize the political process in some way, right? And try to nominate reasonable candidates. At least they used to do that. And keep a certain and play a certain gatekeeping function. And one of the things that we've lost in American politics to a large extent is that gatekeeping function, right? If it's no longer an impediment to your running on a party list, if you went to jail, that's no longer disqualifying. Woo. I mean, that's kind of interesting. Right, and if the parties were a little more robust and cohesive, they'd be more capable of doing ordinary politics, which is, I think, a lot of what we're missing. And they would be more capable of playing this sort of gatekeeping role in American politics, which I think is sorely needed. Not because they're inherently more moral or anything, but because they have an incentive as an organization not to nominate people who will become an embarrassment. And, right, you look on both sides of the aisle now, they're no longer capable of doing that. And so one of the ways in which you might help to strengthen that, it might be to, if campaign finance laws, which I don't comprehend well enough to have any firm opinion about Lana, but if you could reform those laws in a direction that would strengthen the parties and diminish the role of sort of individual leaders and so forth, that might be a good thing.
Right, well, the last question, I guess I'll just jump off of what you just said with this strengthening party apparatus, and hopefully that might help with democracy today. Are there any other solutions or reforms that you might think of or suggest to address any issues in democracy? And is this sort of return to this kind of Madisonian vision of democracy something that we should be trying to strive towards or not?
Let me say this. I mean, there's obviously a lot of concern about the direction in which democracies around the world, including ours, have gone. I think, every once in a while, and sort of out of a corner of my eye, I follow the European debates about these things. They're even more clueless than we are. That may not be saying a lot. But the proliferation of books that are sort of targeted at a non-specialist audience, that are really targeted at, well, this kind of audience, people who are engaged, who are concerned about it, these things, I think that's altogether sort of a hopeful sign and not a bad way of sort of running a free country.
Great. Well, Michael, thank you so much for being here, and thanks everyone for joining. And you can pick up one of those books, Dambisa's, in the museum store. Thank you so much.
At the museum store.
Yes.